The Denver airport terminal was a hive of constant movement and low hums of impatience, a chaotic crossroads where stories intertwined in fleeting moments beneath the bright, artificial lights that reflected off polished floors. Travelers from all walks of life weaved through long serpentine lines that stretched endlessly toward check-in counters and security checkpoints, each person carrying their own burdens, hopes, and destinations. The air was thick with a mixture of anxious anticipation, tired exhaustion, and hurried urgency. Announcements echoed overhead, calling flights and gate changes, while the distant roar of airplanes taking off and landing underscored the relentless pace of modern air travel. Amid this swirl of hurried footsteps and rolling suitcases, Marcus Reed moved with a calm, measured grace that contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy surrounding him. In his early 40s, Marcus was a black man whose presence exuded quiet confidence and purpose, his tailored navy suit fitting impeccably as if it were a second skin, a subtle yet powerful statement of his identity and professionalism in a world that often underestimated him. His steps were deliberate and assured, eyes scanning the crowd with a keen awareness honed by years of navigating spaces where he was both observer and participant, always conscious of the subtle dynamics at play. Though the terminal buzzed with the noise of conversations, children's laughter, and the occasional frustrated sigh, Marcus remained a composed figure, a still point amid the chaos. The weight of his briefcase was familiar, filled not only with documents and devices but with the hopes and responsibilities he carried as a man who had fought hard to claim his place in the professional world. Around him, families juggled bags and restless children, business travelers tapped anxiously on phones, and solo adventurers clutched passports and boarding passes with a mix of excitement and weariness. The fluorescent lights above cast a clinical glow, illuminating faces marked by diverse stories, some etched with the thrill of escape, others shadowed by uncertainty. For Marcus, this terminal was more than just a passage. It was a microcosm of society itself, a place where journeys began and ended, and where moments of vulnerability and resilience played out against the backdrop of relentless movement. As he paused briefly near a cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint scent of jet fuel and polished metal, Marcus's mind drifted to the many flights he had taken before, each a thread in the tapestry of his life, woven with experiences of triumph and challenge. The terminal was no stranger to him. It was a familiar theater where he had faced subtle biases and silent judgments, but also moments of unexpected kindness and connection. Today, as he prepared to board his flight, those memories lent him strength. His gaze met that of a weary mother trying to calm her fussy child, a young man nervously rehearsing a speech, and an elderly couple holding hands with quiet tenderness. In their faces, Marcus saw reflections of the human spirit, resilience, hope, and the quest for belonging. Despite the uncertainties and complexities of the world outside, here in this bustling terminal, these shared experiences connected strangers in an unspoken bond. The digital boards flickered overhead, updating gate assignments and departure times, a constant reminder of the precise choreography required to keep the vast machinery of air travel in motion. Yet beneath this efficiency lay a deeper, more fragile reality, that every traveler was a story, a life in motion, with dreams and fears carried like fragile cargo. Marcus adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, and moved forward, ready to step into the next chapter of his journey, with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through countless challenges. In this crowded terminal, filled with noise and haste, he was a symbol of perseverance and dignity, a reminder that amid the transient chaos of travel, there are moments of grace and humanity that endure. His story was one among many unfolding beneath the bright lights, a testament to the strength found in stillness amid the rush and the courage to move forward, no matter where the path might lead. Harold Benson stood rigidly behind the polished counter of the bustling airport terminal, his sharp eyes scanning the sea of travelers with a practiced scrutiny that teetered dangerously between vigilance and suspicion. As the airport manager, he wielded his authority like a weapon, a strict enforcer of rules whose arrogance often veiled an insecurity that thrived on control and power. The daily chaos of the terminal was his domain, and Harold took a perverse satisfaction in exerting dominance over those who crossed his path, especially when his prejudices whispered that some passengers were inherently more suspicious than others. It was in this charged atmosphere that Marcus entered the scene, a young black man carrying a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle Harold from the moment their eyes met. Without any legitimate reason, Harold's bias clouded his judgment, instantly marking Marcus as a subject for scrutiny and suspicion. As Marcus moved through the terminal with the ease of someone familiar with travel's rhythms, Harold's gaze hardened, reading into every casual glance and measured step as if they were coded signs of guilt. He saw Marcus not as a person, but as a potential threat, a symbol of everything Harold feared or resented lurking in his orderly world. The manager's mind raced with assumptions, unspoken and unsubstantiated, fueling a dangerous resolve to single Marcus out, to make an example of him under the guise of enforcing security. Harold's voice, clipped and commanding, shattered the ambient murmur of the terminal as he ordered one of the security officers to intercept Marcus, his tone leaving no room for question or hesitation. The officer approached with practiced formality, but there was a tension beneath the surface, a charged undercurrent of injustice that Marcus immediately sensed. Though Marcus remained calm, courteous, and cooperative, Harold's suspicions manifested as an invasive scrutiny that violated not just his privacy, but his dignity. The questions posed were relentless yet baseless, designed to unsettle and provoke rather than to seek truth. Marcus's composed responses did little to quell the storm of prejudice that Harold had already stirred. Instead, they seemed to inflame it further, as if calmness itself was an act of defiance. Around them, other travelers watched, some with quiet discomfort, others with indifference, while the interaction became a silent spectacle of power misused and humanity diminished. For Marcus, the experience was a painful reminder of the invisible barriers that shadowed his every step, a stark contrast to the freedom and respect afforded so easily to others. The manager's suspicion was not rooted in fact, but in fear and bias, a reflection of the systemic prejudices that permeated even the most mundane corners of life. Yet beneath Harold's arrogance lay a deeper vulnerability, a fragile ego desperately clinging to control in a world that was changing faster than he could accept. As the encounter unfolded, Marcus's inner strength was tested, his resilience forged in countless previous moments where he had to assert his dignity against assumptions that sought to define him unfairly. The clash between Harold's suspicion and Marcus's quiet dignity was more than a personal confrontation. It was a microcosm of a broader struggle, a fight for recognition, respect, and justice in spaces where those rights were often contested. In the end, Harold's actions revealed less about Marcus and more about the manager himself, a man trapped by his biases, wielding authority not with fairness but with fear, and ultimately undermining the very order he claimed to uphold. Marcus walked away with his head held high, a quiet testament to the power of dignity in the face of suspicion, while Harold was left to reckon with the corrosive weight of prejudice that poisoned his judgment and eroded his integrity. The airport terminal continued to buzz with the comings and goings of countless strangers, but for those who witnessed the moment, the encounter lingered as a stark reminder that suspicion born of bias could wound deeply, distorting truth and perpetuating division. Amidst the hustle of travel and the promise of new beginnings, Harold's suspicion was a shadow, an uncomfortable truth about the fragility of justice when it is clouded by prejudice, and a call to confront the biases that hide behind authority and power. The bustling train station buzzed with the energy of hurried travelers, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors as the clock ticked relentlessly toward the next departure. Marcus stood near his luggage, a quiet figure in the sea of commuters, clutching the handle of his suitcase with an air of weary patience. His eyes scanned the crowd briefly before settling on the ticket counter, mind preoccupied with thoughts of the meeting awaiting him at his destination. The ordinary rhythm of the day shattered abruptly when Harold, a security officer known for his quick temper and rigid judgment, stormed through the crowd toward Marcus with a harsh accusation burning in his eyes. "You there, stop!" Harold's voice boomed across the station, cutting through the chatter and the distant whistle of an arriving train. Startled, Marcus turned slowly, confusion and a flicker of alarm crossing his face as Harold roughly grabbed the handle of his suitcase and yanked it open. From within, Harold produced a small, suspicious bag, its contents unknown to the curious eyes now fixed on the unfolding scene. "What's this? Illegal drugs?" Harold demanded loudly, his tone accusatory and unforgiving, his gaze sharp as a blade. The words hung heavy in the air, igniting a spark that quickly grew into a wildfire of whispers, gasps, and judgmental stares. A crowd gathered instantly, commuters slowing their pace, families clutching children closer, and bystanders drawn to the spectacle as if compelled by a mixture of fear and fascination. The space around Marcus tightened as eyes narrowed, their silent condemnation pressing down like a weight on his shoulders. His heart pounded, not from guilt, but from the sting of false accusation, the unfairness of being thrust into a spotlight of suspicion without cause. Marcus's voice was calm but firm as he protested, "I don't know what you're talking about. That's not mine." Yet his words seemed swallowed by the growing murmur of the crowd, their skepticism unchecked and their judgment swift. Harold, emboldened by the audience, continued to escalate the situation, his accusations now punctuated by pointed fingers and demands for answers Marcus could not give. The scene was a crucible of humiliation and helplessness, a moment where justice felt suspended and prejudice ruled the day. Yet amidst the chaos, Marcus maintained his composure, refusing to let anger or despair break his spirit. His eyes met those of a young mother standing near the edge of the crowd. In her gaze he saw the flicker of doubt, the questioning of the easy assumptions others had made. It was a fragile connection, but it was enough. A reminder that truth often struggles to be heard above the roar of suspicion. The station's usual sounds, the rumble of trains, the chatter of passengers, were drowned out by the tension that hung thickly around Marcus and Harold. People whispered about the dangers lurking in their midst, their fear fueling the rush to condemn before facts could be known. And in that moment, Marcus was not just a man accused. He was a symbol of a deeper issue, the way fear can distort judgment, how quick society is to label and dismiss those who don't fit preconceived notions. As Harold called for backup, and the police officers began to approach, the crowd's mood shifted subtly. Some faces softened, uncertainty replacing certainty as questions began to seep in beneath the surface of accusation. The power of public opinion was formidable, but so too was the resilience of a man standing firm in the face of injustice. Marcus's silence was his shield, his dignity, his quiet protest against a world too eager to judge. And as the officers moved closer, the truth hovered just beyond reach, waiting for a moment to emerge from the shadows of falsehood and fear. The scene encapsulated not just a single accusation but a universal struggle, the battle to be seen and believed in a world quick to assume the worst, where appearances and assumptions could so easily override reality. In the heart of the station's chaos, Marcus's quiet courage shone, a beacon of integrity amid the storm of suspicion, reminding all who watched that justice requires patience, understanding, and above all, a willingness to listen beyond the noise of prejudice. In the crowded, humming terminal of the airport, where the cacophony of rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and overhead announcements created a chaotic soundtrack of travel, Marcus found himself abruptly thrust into the harsh spotlight of scrutiny, his body suddenly seized by Officer Grant, a muscular security guard whose grip was as unyielding as the cold steel of the gates surrounding them, and with a force that spoke louder than any words could. Grant restrained Marcus as if he were a dangerous criminal, twisting the narrative in front of dozens of travelers whose eyes widened in shock and horror, their phones raised instinctively to capture every moment, an involuntary witness to what felt like an unfolding tragedy in public. Marcus's heart pounded fiercely in his chest, a storm of confusion, fear, and humiliation flooding through him as the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists and the tightness of the grip pulled at his arm. The sensation of being physically overpowered, dissolving any semblance of control he had, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a sea of strangers whose faces reflected everything from curiosity to judgment to empathy. The crowd's whispers swelled beneath the roar of cameras clicking and videos recording. And in those watching eyes, Marcus could feel the weight of a narrative being written without his voice, a story that reduced him from a person to a spectacle, from an individual with a complex story to a simple label: suspect, threat, wrongdoer. Yet beneath the rough exterior of Officer Grant's authoritative demeanor was an unsettling disconnect, a failure to see Marcus not as a human being but as a problem to be subdued, a barrier to order to be forcibly removed. The public nature of the restraint only intensified the humiliation, transforming a private moment of confusion and fear into a public display of power and control. A scene replayed on countless phone screens, shared and judged in real time, the viral potential of the moment, adding layers of anxiety and despair to Marcus's already overwhelmed spirit. The security guard's muscles tensed as he maintained his grip, his eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced wariness, unaware or uncaring of the silent storm brewing behind Marcus's steady but strained gaze. A gaze that refused to surrender dignity, even as his body was held captive. Around them, the crowd was a living entity of mixed emotions. Some faces showed hardened judgment, others reflected discomfort, and a few offered fleeting glances of compassion, silently pleading for understanding in a moment that felt both harsh and unjust. Marcus's mind raced, wrestling with the injustice of being treated as a threat rather than a person, wondering how quickly assumptions had stripped away the years of his character, the kindness he carried, and the complexity of his story. Yet amidst the turmoil, a quiet strength flickered within him, a resilience born from years of navigating a world that often judged by appearances and ignored the nuances beneath. The phones recording the moment became mirrors reflecting society's complex relationship with authority and justice. How easily power can tip into oppression, how quickly fear can masquerade as security, and how public spectacle can strip away humanity. Officer Grant, standing tall and resolute, represented the system's face, unyielding, confident, and sometimes blind to the damage done in its name. But Marcus, despite the physical restraint and public exposure, embodied the human cost of that system, a reminder that behind every grip of authority is a person whose story demands to be heard and whose dignity must be preserved. The tension in the air was thick, the charged atmosphere crackling with unspoken questions about fairness, bias, and the balance between safety and empathy. As the moments dragged on, some travelers lowered their phones, discomfort etched in their expressions while others whispered among themselves, grappling with their own roles as witnesses and participants in this modern spectacle. Marcus's breathing grew steadier, not because the grip had loosened, but because inside a resolve hardened. He would not let this moment define him, would not let the force used to control him extinguish the voice that had been silenced. His eyes met those of Officer Grant briefly, a silent exchange loaded with tension, humanity, and the unspoken plea for recognition beyond suspicion. In that fleeting look, there was a glimmer of understanding, fragile yet persistent, reminding both men that beneath roles and uniforms were shared human experiences of fear, hope, and the need for dignity. As security personnel gathered to manage the crowd and questions began to rise, the scene slowly began to dissipate. But the echoes of that grip, both physical and metaphorical, lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Marcus walked away changed, not broken, carrying with him the weight of the moment and the quiet defiance that comes from surviving public judgment with grace intact. Officer Grant returned to his duties, perhaps unaware of the full impact of his actions, embodying the tension between authority and compassion that defines so many encounters in public spaces. And the travelers, each touched in their own way, were left to reflect on the fragility of justice and the human stories hidden behind every incident. Stories that demand more than quick judgments and forceful grips. Stories that require listening, empathy, and a commitment to seeing beyond appearances. In this complex, crowded world, where moments like these play out under the watchful eyes of strangers and screens, Marcus's experience stood as a powerful reminder that dignity and humanity must never be casualties in the pursuit of order, and that sometimes the strongest grip is not the one that holds tight, but the one that chooses to let go with understanding. The moment unfolded like a slow-motion scene in the crowded train car, the clamor of everyday commutes fading into a tense silence punctuated only by whispers, and the occasional sharp intake of breath as Marcus stood at the center of the spectacle, his shoulders tense, eyes flickering between the faces around him, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment, and many shadowed by the cold assumption of guilt that had wrapped itself around him like an invisible chain. Passengers, caught between disbelief and the hunger for drama, began pulling out their phones, fingers trembling as they filmed the unfolding event, eager to capture every tense second, unaware or uncaring of the man whose life was being dissected and displayed before their eyes, each recording a digital scar to be shared, retweeted, and replayed, further feeding the spiral of humiliation that Marcus was trapped in. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some voices sharp with accusation, others edged with disbelief. "He must have done something," one whispered, the phrase passing from mouth to mouth like a contagious virus, breeding an atmosphere thick with prejudice and fear, where innocence was no defense, and appearance was mistaken for proof. Yet amid the sea of judgment, there were flickers of doubt and hesitation, glances exchanged, between strangers questioning whether the quick verdict being handed down was truly justified or simply the product of fear and misunderstanding. In a moment charged with tension, a few passengers leaned closer, their expressions a mix of shock and incredulity, the kind of stunned silence that spoke volumes about the human impulse to believe the worst when confronted with chaos, while others snickered quietly, feeding the humiliation with cruel whispers that echoed louder than any spoken words, turning the scene into a public trial where empathy was drowned out by spectacle. As Marcus's breathing grew heavier and his hands clenched into fists at his sides, the weight of the crowd's gaze bore down on him, a relentless force that stripped away any shred of dignity and replaced it with a raw, aching vulnerability that only deepened the humiliation. Some passengers shook their heads in disbelief, their eyes reflecting the conflict between their instinct to condemn and the uneasy stirrings of empathy that challenged their assumptions. Others, emboldened by the safety of anonymity within the crowd, made jokes and cruel comments, laughter that felt hollow and bitter, revealing not just a hunger for entertainment but the darker human tendency to derive satisfaction from another's misfortune. Yet amid the cacophony, a few quietly cast looks of pity toward Marcus, their hearts aching for the man who had become a spectacle through no fault of his own, and who now bore the unbearable weight of collective judgment and misunderstanding. As phones continued to record, conversations erupted, some demanding justice, others pleading for patience and fairness. But all were caught in the swirling tide of emotions that made the moment feel simultaneously intimate and public. A stark reminder of how quickly a person's life can be laid bare and dissected in a crowd hungry for certainty and drama. For Marcus, the cacophony was a deafening roar inside his head, drowning out reason, leaving only the sting of alienation and the crushing realization that in this moment, he was less a man and more a symbol of suspicion, of fear, of the quick judgments society too often makes without knowing the full story. The humiliation was amplified by the relentless recording, the knowledge that these images would live on, shared and reshared, each replay a fresh wound inflicted by strangers who never sought to understand, but only to witness and pass judgment. Yet beneath the surface of shame and anger, a quiet resolve began to stir within Marcus, a determination not yet visible to the crowd but growing stronger with every whispered accusation and every mocking laugh. A refusal to be defined by this moment alone, and a hope that someday the truth would rise above the noise. As the train hurtled forward, the crowd's reaction became a complex tapestry of human emotions: fear, judgment, empathy, cruelty, and hope, all tangled together in a raw, messy reminder of how easily assumptions can imprison a person, and how vital it is to remember that behind every public spectacle is a human being, whose story deserves to be heard beyond the whispers and the snapshots. And as the scene slowly began to unravel, the echoes of that moment lingered, a haunting testament to the fragile line between justice and judgment, compassion and cruelty, and the profound impact a crowd's reaction can have on a life teetering on the edge of misunderstanding and hope. The scene was unraveling rapidly, a swirl of confusion and suspicion cascading through the crowded room like wildfire, voices rising in frantic bursts, faces contorted with judgment, and hurried whispers fueling a growing storm of misunderstanding. Yet amidst the escalating chaos, Marcus stood like a solitary lighthouse, unwavering and composed, his presence a stark contrast to the tempest of doubt and fear swirling around him. While others around him flailed with frantic gestures or seethed with whispered accusations, Marcus's calm was not born of ignorance or denial, but of a deep-rooted dignity that refused to be shaken by baseless assumptions. His eyes, steady and clear, swept over the restless crowd, the security staff, the curious onlookers, and the murmuring guests, each grappling with their own fears and prejudices. In the thick tension, his voice rose, not in anger or desperation, but in measured, respectful authority, a beacon seeking to pierce the fog of misconception. "Please," he began, his tone firm yet gentle, "before jumping to conclusions, I ask that you verify who I am." There was no arrogance in his request, only the quiet insistence of a man grounded in truth and fairness, appealing to the better angels of those around him. The crowd's volume faltered, uncertainty rippling through the mass as some hesitated, their eyes flickering with doubt and curiosity. Marcus sensed the moment's fragile potential, how easily fear could harden into prejudice or how understanding could blossom if only given a chance. He did not demand respect. He simply embodied it, his posture upright but relaxed, his gaze steady and sincere. Slowly, a security officer stepped forward, retrieving a badge scanner and a phone, the tools to confirm identity that Marcus had calmly suggested. As the verification process unfolded, the room shifted, tense anticipation mingling with growing realization. When the confirmation came through, it was like a breath released after long-held tension. Eyes widened in recognition, whispers shifted to apologies, and the walls of suspicion began to crumble. Marcus did not revel in vindication. Instead, his expression softened, tempered with the wisdom of one who had weathered many storms before. He understood that the ordeal was not simply about proving who he was, but about challenging the quick judgments that so often clouded perception and fractured communities. The moment underscored a profound truth: how easily fear and bias can blind us, and how crucial patience and dignity are in bridging divides. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many carrying with them the weight of their own reflections, Marcus remained poised, a quiet reminder that calmness is a powerful form of resistance in a world too often quick to condemn. His presence, steady and unyielding, was a testament to the strength found not in raising one's voice over the din, but in holding space for truth with unwavering grace. In that charged atmosphere, Marcus's calmness was more than a personal virtue. It became a catalyst for change, a subtle yet profound assertion that beneath the surface of fear lies the possibility of understanding, if only people choose to look beyond their assumptions. The staff, once wary and defensive, now approached with renewed respect, their earlier suspicions replaced by a cautious humility that hinted at lessons learned. And Marcus, aware of the fragility of trust, extended a nod of quiet gratitude before stepping away, knowing that the hardest battles are often fought not with anger, but with dignity and patience. This episode was a microcosm of larger struggles, against prejudice, against snap judgments, and against the corrosive power of fear that can unravel the fabric of connection. Yet it was also a beacon of hope, illustrating how one person's calm resolve can challenge and transform the narrative. The crowd's energy, once crackling with tension, softened into a tentative harmony, the echoes of misunderstanding replaced by the possibility of empathy. Marcus's calmness was not passive, it was a deliberate choice, a shield forged from resilience and self-respect, and a bridge built toward reconciliation. As he walked away from the scene, the weight of what had transpired settled around him like a quiet victory, not in confrontation, but in the power of quiet confidence to dispel darkness and invite light. And in the aftermath, those who witnessed the moment carried with them a renewed awareness that every person deserves the dignity of being seen clearly, beyond the shadows cast by fear, and that sometimes the strongest voices are those spoken softly with conviction and grace. The tension in the bustling airport terminal had been mounting for what felt like hours, voices raised in frustration, anxious passengers shuffling from one line to another, employees exchanging nervous glances as an air of uncertainty thickened with every passing minute. Amid the chaos stood Marcus, a man whose calm demeanor belied the storm swirling around him, eyes scanning the crowd with quiet intensity. Until that moment, he had been just another face among the sea of travelers and staff, his presence unremarkable, his intentions hidden beneath the guise of an ordinary commuter. But as the mounting unrest reached a crescendo, voices accusing the airline of negligence, whispers of safety violations, and rumors swirling about concealed malpractices, Marcus knew the time had come to reveal the truth. With deliberate care, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a sleek leather badge holder, the metal emblem catching the harsh fluorescent light as he flipped it open to expose the official seal of the Federal Aviation Inspectorate. The crowd's murmur instantly faltered into a collective gasp, a ripple of shock sweeping through the throng like an electric current as the gravity of the moment settled over them. Eyes widened, conversation ceased, and a hush fell, punctuated only by the soft shuffle of feet and the occasional sharp intake of breath. Marcus stood firm, embodying the weight of responsibility he carried, as the magnitude of his revelation sank in, not just to the passengers and airline employees, but to himself as well. He was not merely an observer or a passive bystander. He was the authority tasked with uncovering truth amid layers of deception, the man responsible for ensuring that safety and integrity were upheld above all else. His identity transformed the dynamic instantly. No longer an anonymous figure caught in the crossfire of frustrations, he was now a beacon of accountability, a reminder that beneath the polished veneer of corporate promises lay a system subject to scrutiny and justice. As murmurs began to grow, some questioning, others eager for answers, Marcus felt the weight of the moment deepen. He understood that his badge symbolized more than authority. It represented hope for those who had been silenced by bureaucracy, fear for those implicated by negligence, and a call to action for all who believed in fairness and safety. The crowd's emotions ranged widely. Relief from passengers who had feared for their well-being, anger from employees fearing repercussions, and curiosity from onlookers drawn into the unfolding drama. For Marcus, this revelation was not just a career milestone. It was a pivotal point in a journey marked by long nights of investigation, painstaking data analysis, and countless interviews behind closed doors. Every step had led to this moment of exposure, a public unveiling that could not be ignored or dismissed. The airline's senior staff, gathered nearby with strained smiles and guarded postures, suddenly found themselves facing a reckoning. Their carefully crafted narratives and assurances of compliance now seemed fragile and inadequate in the face of the federal inspector's presence. The ripple of shock spread to them, transforming their poised exteriors into flickers of doubt and apprehension. Marcus, feeling the weight of his badge both literally and figuratively, took a step forward, his voice steady and authoritative as he addressed the crowd. "I am here to ensure the safety of every passenger and employee within this airport," he began, his tone firm but measured, conveying the seriousness of his mission without a trace of arrogance. "Recent audits have uncovered significant lapses that must be addressed immediately to prevent any risk to public safety." The crowd absorbed his words with a mixture of shock and understanding, some nodding in agreement while others whispered anxiously among themselves. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted dramatically, from confusion and suspicion to a collective resolve to face uncomfortable truths. Marcus's revelation became a catalyst, igniting conversations not just about the immediate issues at hand, but about the larger systems and structures that allowed such problems to fester unnoticed. For the passengers, it was a sobering reminder of their vulnerability and the importance of vigilance. For the employees, a call to uphold standards and speak out against complacency. And for Marcus, a profound affirmation of the power of transparency and courage. As officials moved swiftly to implement corrective measures, Marcus's presence stood as a symbol of accountability and hope, reassuring those present that the situation was in capable hands. The crowd, once fractured by frustration and fear, began to coalesce into a unified force for change, their attention focused not just on the problems revealed, but on the potential for renewal and improvement. And as the scene gradually settled into one of organized action and cautious optimism, Marcus pocketed his badge once more, aware that while this moment was significant, it was merely the beginning of a much longer journey toward ensuring that trust and safety were never compromised again. The revelation had transformed a chaotic day into a turning point, leaving everyone involved forever changed by the undeniable power of truth unveiled in the light of day. Harold and Officer Grant, once the embodiment of unshakable confidence and unchecked authority, now stood frozen in a stark moment of reckoning, their previous arrogance dissolving into palpable fear and profound regret. As the harsh truth settled over them like a relentless storm, they had falsely accused an innocent man, a grave injustice that weighed heavily not only on their consciences, but now also threatened their very careers and reputations. Yet what compounded their humiliation was the bitter realization that, in their reckless arrogance, they had also insulted the very official entrusted with inspecting and overseeing their conduct, a figure whose presence had been a looming shadow they had arrogantly dismissed, assuming their actions would go unquestioned, only to discover too late the devastating consequences of their hubris. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was thick with tension, the air almost suffocating as Harold's eyes darted nervously, no longer carrying the bravado of a man used to commanding respect, but instead reflecting the deep cracks of fear that now fractured his facade, his jaw clenched tightly, hands trembling ever so slightly, as he faced not only the undeniable evidence of his error, but also the stern, unyielding gaze of the inspector, whose calm yet unwavering demeanor underscored the gravity of the situation. Officer Grant mirrored this transformation, his usual smug smile replaced by a tight-lipped silence, his posture slumped as if the weight of shame pressed heavily upon his shoulders, and the memories of his earlier dismissive remarks, once so full of condescension and arrogance, now echoed bitterly in his mind like a haunting refrain of regret. They had acted recklessly, fueled by a misguided sense of superiority and an overconfidence that blinded them to truth and justice. And now, confronted with the undeniable evidence and the authoritative presence of the inspector, their internal defenses crumbled. The inspector, a figure of quiet strength and unwavering integrity, held them accountable not just for the injustice they had wrought on the innocent man, but also for the damage done to the very institution they were sworn to serve. His words, measured but firm, cut through the haze of denial and arrogance, reminding them of their duty to uphold fairness and truth above all else. Harold and Grant's fear was not merely about personal consequences, though the threat of suspension, investigation, and potential dismissal loomed large, but about the realization that their actions had betrayed the trust of the community, the very people they had sworn to protect, and had tarnished the honor of their profession. As the inspector detailed the extent of their misconduct, the room seemed to grow colder, the walls closing in on them as the magnitude of their failings became impossible to ignore. The once boastful officers who had swaggered through precinct halls now faced the profound loneliness of disgrace, the isolation that comes from knowing one's actions have caused harm beyond repair. In the silence that followed, a heavy sorrow settled in their hearts, regret not just for the false accusations and the damage inflicted on an innocent life, but also for the disrespect shown to the inspector, whose role was to ensure justice and integrity, not to be scorned by those sworn to uphold the law. This moment, brutal in its honesty, was a turning point, a painful but necessary awakening that humility and accountability must replace arrogance and impunity. Around them, colleagues who had once admired their confidence now looked on with a mix of pity and disappointment, a silent testament to the cost of hubris. The inspector's stern but fair admonition was a reminder that authority is not a license for cruelty or neglect, but a responsibility demanding vigilance and respect. As Harold and Grant absorbed the full weight of their mistakes, a flicker of remorse ignited within them, a fragile hope that perhaps this shattering experience might lead to genuine reflection and change. Yet even in that small ember of possibility, the bitter truth remained. They had lost more than professional standing. They had betrayed the principles they were meant to embody and had inflicted real pain on an innocent person. The inspector's presence, once dismissed as inconsequential, now symbolized the inescapable reach of justice and the essential role of oversight in safeguarding the rights and dignity of all individuals. In their silent acknowledgement of fault, Harold and Grant faced the harsh reality that redemption would not come easily, and that the path forward would require not only accountability, but also a deep, sustained commitment to rebuilding trust that had been shattered by their reckless actions and tainted attitudes. Their fear and regret were not simply personal emotions, but reflections of a larger failure, one that threatened to erode the very foundation of the institution they represented. As the meeting drew to a close, the inspector's final words lingered in the room, a solemn charge to remember that every action carries consequences, and that true courage lies in admitting mistakes and striving to do better. Harold and Officer Grant, once emboldened by arrogance and dismissiveness, now understood the heavy cost of their misjudgment, their faces etched with the lines of newfound humility and the painful awareness of what they had lost. The tables had turned with unforgiving clarity, leaving them not as masters of their fate but as humbled men confronting the truth, their journey toward redemption just beginning in the shadow of their own mistakes. In that moment, the lesson was clear and universal. Power without accountability is a dangerous illusion, and only through respect, integrity, and honest self-reflection can trust be restored and justice truly served. As the evening drew to a close in a grand hall once dominated by unchecked power and superficial judgments, Marcus found himself standing amidst a crowd whose faces had shifted from confident assurance to stunned silence and whispered uncertainty. The room, once filled with echoes of authority and entitlement, now hummed with the quiet but relentless spread of rumors, whispers of downfall, failure, and reckoning that all pointed toward Harold, a man who had long held his position by clinging tightly to prejudice and false appearances. Harold's grip on power, once so secure and commanding, had loosened in the face of undeniable truth and fairness, leaving him speechless and isolated, the weight of his misjudgments crushing any remaining facade of control. In stark contrast to Harold's crumbling dominance, Marcus exuded a calm dignity that radiated a strength far more compelling than titles or bluster. His presence was a living testament to the idea that true authority is not about the illusion of invincibility or the power to intimidate, but rather about the grace to wield influence with empathy, fairness, and unwavering integrity. As Marcus prepared to leave this pivotal scene, his every step carried the profound message that appearances can be deceiving and that leadership demands a commitment to justice over bias, humility over arrogance. This departure was not merely a physical exit, but a symbolic closing chapter of a story where prejudice and cruelty were finally confronted and overcome by dignity and fairness. The emotional resonance of this moment was undeniable. Those present felt the sting of their own assumptions and the sobering truth that power misused inevitably leads to downfall. It was a collective reckoning, a moment when the veneer of Harold's authority peeled away to reveal the fragility beneath, and when the quiet strength of Marcus's example illuminated a path forward that many had long ignored. The whispers about Harold's demise spreading rapidly through the crowd became a cautionary tale that no amount of status or bravado can shield one from the consequences of injustice and prejudice. These murmurs carried more than just gossip. They bore the weight of a timeless lesson that true respect is earned through fairness, not fear, through empathy, not exclusion, and through a genuine commitment to treating others with dignity, regardless of outward appearance. This story taps into a universal emotional experience, the painful unraveling of illusions and the hopeful emergence of a more just and compassionate understanding of leadership. It invites readers and listeners alike to reflect on the ways in which they may unconsciously judge or exclude others based on superficial traits, and challenges them to embrace a deeper awareness that leadership and authority come with the responsibility to uplift, not belittle. Marcus's graceful exit from the scene marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the individuals present, but for anyone who would hear the story and recognize its powerful call for change. It was a call to reject prejudice and arrogance, to hold those in power accountable, and to choose dignity and fairness as the true foundations of influence. The emotional journey here is both personal and collective. Personal in the way individuals confront their biases, and collective in the broader societal implications of just leadership. In this narrative, Marcus embodies the ideal leader, not one who dominates through fear or appearance, but one who commands respect through consistent fairness and humility. Meanwhile, Harold's silence is a powerful reminder of what happens when authority is abused and when people allow prejudice to cloud their judgment. The story concludes with a profound sense of closure and hope. It acknowledges the pain and disruption caused by the fall of a powerful figure, but also celebrates the triumph of dignity over arrogance. As Marcus walks away, leaving behind a room transformed by this revelation, the message lingers. Real power is a sacred responsibility, one that must be exercised with compassion, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to justice. It is a message that transcends the particular moment and speaks to the heart of what it means to lead and to live honorably in a world too often swayed by appearances and assumptions. In the end, the story's final lesson is clear and unforgettable. Authority rooted in fairness and respect endures, while arrogance built on prejudice inevitably crumbles, leaving behind only whispers and regrets. Marcus's dignified departure offers a beacon of hope for a future where leadership is measured not by superficial power, but by the courage to act justly and the wisdom to see beyond appearances, reminding us all that the true legacy of any person lies in the fairness they show and the dignity they uphold. In the twilight of a long, charged evening, Marcus stood poised with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the room, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that clung to the grand hall where power had been exercised so carelessly for far too long. Around him, the crowd, once brimming with confidence and entitlement, had been reduced to a sea of whispered conversations and glances filled with shock, regret, and disbelief. The figure at the center of this unraveling was Harold, a man whose iron grip on authority had long been maintained through prejudice, harsh judgments, and a superficial command of respect rooted not in fairness but in fear and bias. Tonight, all of Harold's carefully constructed facades crumbled, leaving him speechless, isolated by the very people who had once bowed to his influence. He was no longer the imposing figure towering over the room. Instead, he was diminished by the recognition that his power was a fragile illusion, sustained by arrogance and an unwillingness to see beyond appearances. In contrast, Marcus's calm and collected presence radiated a strength far more profound and lasting. one born not of dominance but of compassion, fairness, and moral clarity. As Marcus prepared to exit the scene, every step he took carried with it a powerful and enduring message. That true authority is not found in appearances or titles, but in the consistent and courageous exercise of fairness, empathy, and respect for others. This moment was not just about one man's departure. It was a symbolic closing of a chapter where prejudice and cruelty had been allowed to govern, replaced now by the promise of a new order rooted in justice and dignity. The emotional core of this story lay in the sharp contrast between two very different visions of power, one fueled by arrogance and prejudice, the other guided by humility and fairness, and the profound impact this contrast had on all who bore witness. For those in the room, the shock of Harold's downfall was as much an internal reckoning as it was a public spectacle, forcing them to confront their own assumptions and the culture of injustice that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Meanwhile, Marcus's graceful exit offered a beacon of hope, an example of how integrity and dignity could triumph even in the most challenging circumstances. The whispers spreading about Harold's collapse did more than tell a tale of personal failure. They became a broader warning about the dangers of allowing prejudice to shape authority. No matter how powerful a person may seem, the story reminded all present and those who would hear it later that power misused inevitably leads to ruin, and that appearances, no matter how carefully crafted, can never mask the truth forever. This narrative's emotional resonance lies in its relatability. It echoes the human experience of witnessing or enduring unfair judgment, the pain of realizing one has been blinded by surface impressions, and the yearning for leaders who embody fairness and justice. It calls on readers and listeners to reflect on their own biases and to embrace a vision of leadership that values dignity over dominance, compassion over cruelty. Marcus's example challenges the notion that authority should be wielded as a weapon. Instead, it is a responsibility that demands empathy and fairness, qualities that protect and uplift rather than harm and diminish. As Marcus stepped away from the hall that night, he did more than leave a room. He left behind a legacy of hope and a blueprint for what true leadership can and should be. The scene transformed in that moment from a place of fear and prejudice into one where the seeds of change were planted, where the lessons of humility, fairness, and respect began to take root in the hearts and minds of all who witnessed the fall of a once mighty empire. The story closes on a note of powerful clarity, that dignity and wisdom hold greater and more lasting power than arrogance and superficial appearances ever could. It is a call to reject the false allure of power built on fear, and to embrace a leadership grounded in justice and kindness, reminding us all that the true measure of greatness lies not in the dominance one wields but in the fairness and compassion one shows to others. Marcus's dignified walk away from the scene was a silent but profound statement, one that will echo in the memories of those present for years to come, reminding them that authority must always be exercised with fairness, lest it crumble beneath the weight of its own prejudice. The legacy left by this night is one that transcends individual fate, speaking to a universal truth about human dignity, the dangers of arrogance, and the transformative power of justice. It teaches that while appearances can easily deceive, the authentic strength of a person or leader is revealed through their humility, fairness, and respect for all, regardless of status or circumstance. And so, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the whispers of Harold's downfall faded into the night, a new story began, a story of hope, integrity, and the enduring power of true leadership that inspires us all to look beyond the surface and lead with heart.